Is this supposed to be a joke? The CEO snapped, her voice cutting sharply through the pressurized air of the private executive hangar. My entire engineering team has been analyzing this flight control system for 40 minutes, and we are still completely locked out of the primary terminal. The mechanic didn't argue. He didn't even look up immediately. He simply reached past her high-priced consultants, tapped a swift 4-key sequence on the auxiliary manual override panel, adjusted a hidden system pressure valve beneath the console, and closed the primary diagnostic interface before anyone else in the room realized what he had done. The massive digital display flashed a vibrant green. Outside the glass casing, the twin-turbine engines of the experimental luxury aircraft hummed to life, purring with a flawless, even rhythm. For a long, stunned second, the most powerful woman in the aerospace industry could only stare at the quiet mechanic in the grease-stained uniform standing beside her multi-million-dollar prototype. Because sometimes, the person everyone overlooks understands the machine far better than the elite minds running the corporation. No one in that gleaming aviation complex had ever looked twice at the low-level maintenance technician pushing his heavy tool cart across the polished epoxy floors. But in the brief glow of that diagnostic monitor, the CEO had caught a glimpse of something that absolutely did not belong there. It wasn't a standard corporate interface. It was a sequence of deeply buried, core-level architecture code, an encrypted system model that her own top-tier software developers had spent months trying to crack. And suddenly the quiet mechanic didn't look quite so ordinary anymore. The man's name was Garrett Vance. The most striking thing about Garrett was his utter lack of panic when powerful people raised their voices. He didn't flinch under pressure, and he never hurried his movements. He simply wiped his calloused hands on a worn utility rag tucked into his belt and took a step back from the advanced flight deck console. "I just cleared the pressurized block in the secondary data stream," Garrett said, his voice low and remarkably grounded. "Your system was trying to run an update while the auxiliary fuel pumps were still initializing. It locked itself out to protect the manifold." Vivian Sterling, the brilliant, fiercely guarded CEO of Aero Vanguard Technologies, narrowed her eyes. She had built a multi-billion-dollar defense and aviation empire by reading human behavior faster than anyone else in the room. Something about this man's posture didn't align with his employment file. "You understood our proprietary manifold sequencing?" she asked, her tone dripping with intense suspicion. Garrett gave a slight, unassuming shrug of his shoulders. "Systems get stubborn when you try to force them," he replied quietly. "Just like people." That answer didn't satisfy her. Across the vast premium hangar bay of Crestview Ridge Executive Airfield, floor-to-ceiling glass panes revealed a sweeping view of the dark runway outside. High-end private jets sat like silent predators under the distant tarmac lights, while inside the facility, everything gleamed with corporate wealth. Polished chrome tools, state-of-the-art diagnostic bays, and expensive silence. Garrett stood in the center of it all in his faded blue uniform, completely out of place, yet entirely unbothered. "How did you know exactly which override pathway to trigger?" Vivian pressed, stepping closer. Garrett hesitated just a fraction of a second, his expression completely unreadable. "Just a lucky guess, ma'am. I see a lot of these setups while doing the nightly inspections." She studied him for another tense moment, trying to find a crack in his calm demeanor. Finally, she waved her hand dismissively, turning her back to him. "Fine. Whatever it was, just ensure the primary bay is cleared. My lead international investors land at sunrise, and this prototype needs to be flawless." Garrett nodded once, his expression respectful but distant. "Of course, Miss Sterling." He gripped the handle of his heavy tool cart and began pushing it toward the exit. The low, rhythmic squeak of the rubber wheels echoed against the pristine walls of the high-tech facility. Behind him, Vivian reopened her master tablet, intending to double-check the flight readiness logs. But as her eyes swept across the lingering system data, she froze. Just before Garrett had closed out the manual override window, a secondary system matrix had briefly flashed in the background. It wasn't a standard Aero Vanguard program. It was a complex, beautiful tapestry of aerodynamic telemetry, system vulnerability mapping, and encrypted aviation code. It looked less like a routine mechanical fix, and more like someone was quietly monitoring the entire structural network of the aircraft from a ghost terminal. Meanwhile, Garrett stepped out into the dim, cool corridor of the secondary maintenance wing, letting the heavy security doors click shut behind him. The bright glare of the executive bay faded into the quiet shadows of the late-night shift. He exhaled a long, heavy breath, leaning his back against the cool metal wall. Reaching down into the bottom compartment of his tool cart, beneath a stack of heavy wrenches and hydraulic fluids, he pulled out a rugged, scratched black digital slate. The casing was battered and old, but the moment the screen ignited, a highly sophisticated, real-time data stream filled the display. Garrett's eyes darkened as he analyzed the scrolling code. Rows of automated system pings were lighting up across the Aero Vanguard mainframe, followed by a persistent deep-level system anomaly buried inside the experimental jet's main navigation server. That is definitely not a standard glitch, Garrett muttered to himself, rubbing his jaw. The digital footprint was faint, but it was growing bolder. Someone was actively probing the prototype's core flight systems from the outside, carefully searching for a weak point in the encryption. Garrett stared at the blinking amber warning on his screen, a heavy weight settling in his chest. He hadn't planned on getting involved in corporate crises ever again. This job was supposed to be simple, quiet, and completely invisible. Just an ordinary mechanic maintaining fleet vehicles, working the late shifts so he could be the one to drop off his 7-year-old daughter at the school gates every single morning. It was a simple life, a safe life, the exact kind of life that kept his heavy military past buried where no one could ever find it. His tablet vibrated softly in his hand. The complex data stream vanished, replaced by a picture of a little girl with bright, hopeful eyes, proudly holding up a hand-drawn picture of a balsa wood glider. Chloe. Garrett's entire face softened, the hardened edge of his jaw relaxing instantly. "Hey, sweetheart," he murmured gently to the screen. He checked the digital clock in the corner. He still had a few hours left on his maintenance shift before he could clock out, drive home through the mountain fog, and help her finish the miniature wind tunnel project they had been building on the kitchen table all week. But as he stared at the photo, the amber warning on his digital slate began to flash a violent, dangerous crimson. The external probe wasn't just exploring anymore. If Garrett was reading the cascading telemetry correctly, the intruder was setting up a full-scale system hijack. If the engineers upstairs allowed that prototype plane to take off for the investors in the morning, the entire navigation array could be compromised mid-air. Millions of dollars in technology, and more importantly, human lives, were hanging by a thread. Garrett closed the rugged slate slowly, his fingers tightening around the edge. "This isn't your problem anymore, Vance," he told himself, his voice echoing hollowly in the empty corridor. He placed the device back into its hidden compartment, picked up his inspection flashlight, and prepared to walk down the line of transport vans. But before he could take a single step, a low, unnatural vibration shuddered through the floorboards of the facility. Deep within the structural walls of the airfield, a secondary emergency siren began to pulse. It wasn't the loud, echoing horn of a fire alarm. It was a quiet, high-frequency electronic tone. A core system integrity breach. Garrett looked back toward the executive hangar doors, then down at his tool cart. The quiet mechanic closed his eyes and let out a sharp, resigned sigh. Because sometimes, the hardest part of walking away from your past is pretending you don't know exactly how to save everyone around you. And somewhere up in the main control deck, the danger was escalating rapidly. The electronic pulse hummed through the concrete foundations of the airfield, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the tools inside Garrett's heavy cart. He stood at the intersection of the maintenance corridor, his body turning naturally toward the exit gates where his truck was parked. He thought of Chloe, tucked safely under her blankets at home, dreaming of wooden gliders. He needed to leave. This world of corporate espionage, high-stakes defense contracts, and fragile billionaire egos was a ghost he had buried a long time ago. But the rhythm of the siren changed. It transitioned from a standard system alert to a triple-pulse emergency beacon, a forced entry protocol. Garrett swore quietly under his breath. He turned his cart around, his boots clicking with a steady, deliberate pace against the floor, as he headed toward the secondary executive lounge adjoining the main hangar bay. When he pushed the heavy frosted glass doors open, the scene inside was entirely detached from the cold, ruthless efficiency Vivian Sterling usually projected. The multi-billion-dollar CEO was standing in the center of the plush, modern room, her perfectly tailored suit wrinkled, her hands trembling violently. On the sleek leather sofa across from her sat a small boy, no older than 7, curled into a tight ball. It was Julian Cross, Vivian's son, whom she often kept close during late-night corporate rollouts. The child was trapped in a severe spiral of sensory overload. The piercing high-frequency electronic tones bouncing off the glass walls, combined with the rhythmic flashing of the red emergency beacons, had triggered a massive panic attack. He was clutching his ears, his chest heaving in frantic shallow gasps, his eyes wide with absolute terror. Vivian was desperate, her usual commanding tone failing her completely. "Julian, look at me," she commanded, her voice cracking with a rare, terrifying vulnerability. "You need to slow your breathing down right now." "Julian, listen to my voice," but her panic was only feeding his. Her words sounded like corporate directives rather than comfort, and the boy only wept harder, his small frame shaking as he began to hyperventilate. The most powerful woman in the aerospace industry stood completely helpless, realizing that all her wealth, her corporate empires, and her global influence could not buy a single shred of peace for her frightened child. Garrett stepped into the room, setting his inspection flashlight down on a side table with a soft grounding click. He didn't look at Vivian. He didn't ask for permission. He simply moved across the room with a quiet, steady masculinity that immediately altered the frantic energy of the space. He knelt on the hard floor right in front of the sofa, dropping his large frame down to Julian's exact eye level. He didn't reach out aggressively. He just sat there, a massive, unshakable presence covered in grease and worn denim. "Hey there, partner," Garrett said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble, completely steady, completely warm. It was the voice of a father who had spent years comforting a little girl through night terrors and scraped knees. Julian's tear-filled eyes flicked toward the mechanic. "That noise out there is just the hangar doors playing tricks on the computers," Garrett murmured gently, keeping his hands open and relaxed. "It's loud, but it can't come through these walls. Look at me. Just focus right here." Garrett took a deep, exaggerated breath, letting his chest expand slowly, then exhaled with a long, calm sigh. "Let's count the rivets on my tool cart out there. Can you do that with me?" Nice and slow. Vivian watched, entirely frozen, as the quiet mechanic completely took control of the situation. Her breath hitched in her throat. Julian's frantic gasps began to slow, his small chest naturally rising and falling in perfect synchronization with Garrett's steady breathing pattern. Within less than a minute, the boy's hands slipped away from his ears. He reached out, his small fingers tentatively gripping the rough, oil-stained sleeve of Garrett's uniform, seeking the absolute safety the stranger provided without even trying. The contrast was striking. Vivian, who controlled thousands of lives with a stroke of a pen, felt an intense wave of vulnerability wash over her. She possessed everything the world could offer, yet this humble mechanic possessed the one thing she lacked: a grounded, emotional security that money could never replicate. Her sharp eyes narrowed as she studied Garrett's profile. The way he carried his weight, the absolute calculation beneath his gentle demeanor, the complete absence of fear in a high-stress environment. This man wasn't a standard technician. No ordinary grease monkey handled a billionaire's crisis with this level of tactical composure. Before she can find her voice to question him, the heavy security doors of the lounge burst open. Marcus Thorne, the arrogant chief of avionics at Aero Vanguard, rushed into the room, his forehead slick with sweat, holding a diagnostic tablet that was lighting up with critical errors. "Miss Sterling, we have a catastrophic development," Thorne stammered, his polished corporate demeanor completely shattered. "The primary navigation core isn't just experiencing a standard glitch. Someone has bypassed our external firewall and initiated a structural lock command. If we don't sever the link in less than 4 minutes, the entire flight architecture of the prototype jet will be permanently corrupted." Vivian's cold executive mask snapped back into place instantly, though her fingers still retained a slight tremor. She stepped away from the sofa, looking at Thorne's chaotic screen. Then her gaze slowly drifted back down to Garrett, who was calmly helping Julian sit up on the couch. Garrett stood up slowly, his posture shifting, the gentle fatherly warmth vanishing as a hard military-grade focus took its place. He glanced at the scrolling code on Thorne's tablet from 5 feet away, his jaw tightening. "That's not an external firewall bypass, Thorne," Garrett said quietly, his voice cutting through the technician's frantic breathing. Thorne rounded on him, his face flushing with immediate anger. "Who let the janitorial staff into the executive area? Get this man out of my sight. We are facing a multi-billion-dollar system collapse." But Vivian raised a single trembling hand, her sharp gaze locked entirely on the quiet mechanic. "Shut up, Marcus," she commanded, her voice absolute and chilling. She took a step toward Garrett, the deep suspicion in her eyes burning with an intense unspoken demand for answers. "What exactly do you see, Garrett?" Garrett stared at the monitor as the digital countdown clock on the wall began its final descent, leaving the entire room hanging on his next breath. Marcus Thorne's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. "You are a line-item technician, Vance. You grease landing gears and patch hydraulic fluid leaks. You do not dictate network security parameters to the chief of avionics. Miss Sterling, this is absurd. We are on a strict timeline, and security protocols dictate that uncleared personnel be escorted from the executive wing immediately during a Level 3 system breach." Vivian didn't look at Thorne. Her eyes remained anchored to Garrett, tracking the absolute stillness in his posture. The red light from the emergency beacon swept across his face, highlighting the hard, angular lines of his jaw. "Tell me what you see, Garrett," Vivian said, her voice dropping to a dangerously slight quiet register that carried far more weight than their shouting. Garrett didn't hesitate. He stepped past Thorne, completely ignoring the man's aggressive stance, and looked directly at the glowing tablet screen. He didn't touch the device. He just stared at the rapidly cascading columns of digital telemetry. The intrusion isn't attacking your external firewall, Garrett explained calmly. Look at the data packaging sizes. They are too small, too clean. If this were a brute force external hack, your primary server gateway would be flooded with junk data packets to slow down your defensive responses. But your gateway is completely clear. The traffic is moving smoothly through your secondary diagnostic relays. Thorne scoffed, throwing his hands in the air. That is standard diagnostic routing for an advanced system recovery. No, Garrett said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying an unshakable authority that made the room instantly go quiet. It is an internal mirror protocol. Someone didn't break into your house, Thorne. They are already sitting at your kitchen table, using your own spare keys. The signal is being generated from a local node right here on the airfield network. Thorne's jaw tightened, his eyes darting quickly between Vivian and the mechanic. That is entirely impossible. Our local node requires a biometric security clearance token. No one on the night shift has access to that kind of network architecture, except for my senior design staff. Are you accusing my engineers of sabotage? Before the argument could escalate further, a soft tug pulled at the hem of Garrett's work shirt. Garrett looked down. Julian was standing right beside him now, having crept off the leather sofa. The little boy was no longer crying, but his eyes were wide with a lingering anxiety as the electronic alarms continued to pulse through the walls. He wasn't looking at his mother, and he certainly wasn't looking at the red-faced avionics chief. He was looking entirely at Garrett, searching for the same unyielding safety he had felt just moments before. Julian reached up, holding out his small hand. In his palm was a tiny, reflective silver bolt he had picked up from the edge of Garrett's tool cart earlier. "Is the plane going to be okay?" the boy whispered softly. Garrett slowly knelt back down, completely removing himself from the high-stress corporate conflict for a brief, intentional moment. He took the small silver bolt from Julian's hand, balancing it perfectly on his thumb before closing the boy's fingers back over it. "The plane is just having a little disagreement with the computers, Julian," Garrett said, his voice steady, warm, and entirely comforting. "But do you know what we do when things get loud? We stay steady. You keep that bolt in your pocket. As long as you are holding on to it, you are the chief inspector of this room. Can you do that for me?" Julian nodded quickly, a small, genuine smile breaking through his pale, exhausted face. He slipped the bolt into his pocket and took a step back, standing tall right next to Garrett's work trousers, completely anchored by the man's quiet strength. Vivian watched the entire interaction from 3 feet away, her breath caught in her chest. For years, she had surrounded her son with the finest doctors, elite tutors, and expensive private security details, yet none of them had ever managed to calm one of his sensory episodes this quickly. This mechanic, earning a basic hourly wage, had achieved total emotional security for her child without even trying. The stark contrast between her massive wealth and Garrett's innate capability struck her with a profound, humbling force. She realized right then that all the money in her executive accounts meant absolutely nothing if she couldn't give her child the peace this man carried in his posture. Her face hardened as she turned back to Thorne. "Check the local node logs, Marcus." Right now, Thorne swallowed hard, his fingers trembling slightly as he began tapping commands into his master tablet. "I am pulling up the internal relay pathways now," he muttered, trying to regain his professional composure. "But I assure you, Ms. Sterling, this mechanic is just throwing out random technical jargon to look useful. There is no way an internal trace will show." The tablet suddenly let out a sharp, discordant electronic chime. Thorne's words died in his throat. The color completely drained from his face as a massive string of crimson code locked onto the center of his screen. The diagnostic window displayed a direct local hardware identification address. Garrett leaned over slightly, his sharp eyes reading the terminal data before Thorne could hide it. "The signal isn't just local," Garrett murmured, his tone shifting into something chillingly precise. "It is coming from inside the main maintenance hangar bay. Terminal 4, the automated fueling station." Vivian's eyes flared with immediate anger. "Terminal 4 is restricted. Only executive staff and primary flight engineers have the encryption keys for that console." "Exactly," Garrett said, his gaze locking directly onto Thorne's panicked expression. "And right now that terminal just initiated a secondary protocol. It isn't trying to steal your data anymore, Ms. Sterling." Thorne backed away a step, his chest heaving. "What are you talking about?" Garrett pointed to the blinking timer at the bottom of the screen, which had suddenly jumped into a rapid, aggressive countdown. They just bypassed the primary fuel emergency shutoff. They are preparing to vent the main fuel cells right onto the hangar floor, while the turbine igniters are still live. A sudden, violent metallic clang echoed from the main hangar bay outside the lounge windows. The massive, multi-ton overhead steel security doors began to slide downward automatically, sealing the executive hangar shut from the outside world. "We are being locked in," Garrett said quietly, his eyes narrowing as the heavy iron doors met the concrete floor with a definitive, thundering crash. And we have exactly 3 minutes before this entire facility turns into an inferno. Marcus Thorne dropped his tablet. The expensive glass shattered against the polished floor, but nobody cared. The high-frequency alarm pitch shifted into a rhythmic, deafening scream. Through the heavy plate glass windows of the executive lounge, the massive experimental jet sat under the harsh white lights of the hangar. From beneath its wings, a thick, shimmering sheet of aviation fuel began to pour onto the concrete floor, spreading rapidly like a dark, reflective lake. The ventilation fans groaned, automatically shutting down to prevent the spread of fumes, which only made the air inside the sealed room turn thick and suffocating. The distinct chemical sting of raw fuel began to seep through the door seals. "This is a mistake," Thorne stammered, his hands clawing at the wall-mounted emergency intercom. "The system is malfunctioning. The manual override code should work. I wrote the safety parameters myself." He punched a 5-digit pin into the wall panel, but the small screen only flashed a mocking, cold response. "Access denied. Integrity compromised." Vivian Sterling didn't look at her chief of avionics. She had completely lost her icy executive composure. Her hands shook violently as she pulled Julian tightly against her chest, shielding his eyes from the spreading disaster outside the glass. The boy was completely silent now, paralyzed by the sheer terror of the flashing red lights and his mother's sudden helplessness. "Marcus, turn it off!" Vivian screamed, her voice cracking under a wave of maternal panic. "My son is in this room. Cut the power to the entire facility. Do something." "I can't," Thorne yelled back, his voice pitching high into a frantic, unmanly squeal. "The network has completely isolated this wing. The central server thinks there is an active fire, so it locked the blast doors down to contain the blast. It's an automated defense protocol. It won't accept my credentials." Thorne was completely broken, reduced to a trembling mess, clutching his expensive tailored collar as he realized his multi-million-dollar software design had just turned into their cage. Garrett Vance walked past him. His movements were the exact opposite of the chaos tearing through the room. He was a mountain of absolute calm. He walked over to his heavy maintenance cart, which sat parked near the exit door, and reached into the side compartment. He didn't pull out a high-tech tablet. He pulled out a heavy, double-insulated manual torque wrench and a thick length of solid copper grounding wire. "Thorne," Garrett said, his low voice instantly cutting through the noise. "Get away from the wall panel." Thorne rounded on him, his face twisting in a mix of terror and elite arrogance. "Stay back, you idiot. You're going to get us killed. This is a highly sensitive, software-driven digital interface. You can't just smash it with a wrench." Garrett didn't waste breath arguing. He stepped forward, grabbed Thorne by the shoulder of his expensive suit, and firmly moved him 3 feet backward. The sheer, effortless physical strength of the mechanic made Thorne freeze mid-sentence. Garrett didn't smash the screen. Instead, he slipped the flat edge of the torque wrench into the narrow seam between the digital aluminum housing and the concrete wall. With a sharp, precise twist of his wrist, the heavy metal gave way with a loud metallic snap. The faceplate popped loose, exposing a dense cluster of fiber optic lines and a thick legacy analog circuit board hidden deep behind the digital gloss. "What are you doing?" Thorne gasped, stepping forward again. "That's the primary relay link. If you short-circuit that board, the main turbine igniters will default to a hardwired emergency discharge sequence. The spark will ignite the fuel vapor outside." "The software is a mirror, Thorne," Garrett said, his eyes scanning the colorful matrix of wires with terrifying speed. "The intruder wants you trying to solve this digitally because it keeps you busy while the timer runs out. But you forgot one thing about this airfield's infrastructure." Garrett reached deep into the exposed panel, his large fingers moving with the precise dexterity of a surgeon. "The physical grid always beats the digital lie," Garrett murmured. Vivian watched him, her breath suspended in her throat. She noticed the way Garrett's eyes didn't drift, how his hands remained completely steady, even as the digital countdown on the wall reached 45 seconds. He wasn't guessing. He knew the layout of the hidden circuitry better than the men who had signed the construction permits for the facility. Garrett took the length of solid copper grounding wire. He bypassed the main digital microprocessors entirely, shoving the raw metal ends directly into 2 legacy brass terminals located at the very bottom of the housing. "Vance, stop!" Thorne shrieked, covering his face. "That's an obsolete military-grade analog bypass. It's completely undocumented." A violent, blinding blue spark erupted from the panel, casting long, sharp shadows across the room. The smell of ozone filled the air. Instantly, the deafening high-frequency alarm cut out. Outside the glass window, the low, dangerous hum of the experimental aircraft's turbine igniters died completely. The twin engines spun down into absolute, silent stillness. The lake of fuel on the hangar floor remained dark and unmoving, safe from the lethal spark that had been seconds away from discharging. The central wall monitor flickered. The crimson warning text vanished. In its place, a system-level command terminal initialized, scrolling through thousands of lines of encrypted validation code at a blinding speed. Thorne slowly lowered his hands, staring at the screen in absolute unmoving shock. The igniters are cold. You cut the ignition matrix through a legacy terminal. How did you even know those brass bypass nodes existed? Aero Vanguard removed those from the blueprints 9 years ago. Garrett didn't answer him. He kept his eyes fixed on the system monitor as the validation script finished loading. The screen didn't display a standard corporate welcome message. As the final layer of encryption cleared, a single line of bright white military-grade text locked onto the center of the display, illuminating the entire room. Override code accepted. Project Vanguard. Welcome back, Chief Engineer Vance. The room fell into an immediate suffocating silence. Marcus Thorne's jaw dropped, his eyes darting from the glowing screen to the quiet mechanic standing in front of the ruined wall panel. Vivian Sterling slowly let go of her son, her sharp eyes widening as the pieces of the puzzle violently snapped into place. She stared at the man in the grease-stained uniform, realization hitting her like a physical blow. Project Vanguard, Vivian whispered, her voice trembling with an emotion she hadn't felt in a decade. The classified Black Ops aviation program that designed our entire corporate foundation. The lead architect vanished without a trace 8 years ago. She stepped toward him, her gaze locked onto his face. You aren't Garrett Vance, the night shift mechanic. Garrett slowly wrapped the utility rag around his knuckles, his expression hardening back into a cold, unreadable wall of quiet masculinity. Before he could speak, the main monitor flashed again, a secondary warning icon pulsing in the corner. The internal mirror protocol wasn't finished. The local node inside the hangar was initializing a complete deletion command, targeting the entire historical log file of the airfield. The trace is deleting, Garrett said, his voice entirely devoid of personal emotion. And whoever just tried to burn us alive is clearing their tracks from inside the building. Marcus Thorne stumbled backward until his spine hit the mahogany cabinets of the executive lounge. His eyes were wide, fixed entirely on the text scrolling across the main wall terminal. Chief Engineer Vance, the legendary architect who had built the original foundational matrix for Project Vanguard, the highly classified military defense contract that had launched Aero Vanguard Technologies into a multi-billion-dollar empire. Thorne's voice was a pathetic, breathless squeak. You designed the core system architecture. The entire global flight network runs on the Vance protocol. It's impossible. You died in an operational accident over the Pacific 8 years ago. Garrett didn't look at him. He didn't offer an explanation, a correction, or a single word of validation to the man who had spent the last 6 months treating him like an invisible piece of the scenery. The quiet mechanic was completely gone, replaced by a man of absolute, unyielding precision. The log purge is moving at 80 gigabytes per second, Garrett said, his low voice slicing cleanly through Thorne's frantic stammering. If that deletion command completes its loop, it won't just erase the identity of the person who initiated the fuel dump. It will wipe the primary cryptographic keys for every experimental aircraft in our fleet. The entire system will go dark. Vivian Sterling stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs with a violence she hadn't felt in a decade. Her sharp, calculating mind was spinning, trying to reconcile the image of the grease-stained night shift worker with the brilliant aviation legend standing before her. She looked down at Julian, who was standing perfectly still against her side. The little boy wasn't panicking anymore. He was staring at Garrett with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe, his small hand still clutched tightly around the silver bolt in his pocket. The safety this man radiated was so absolute that it had entirely shielded her son from the terror of a crumbling building. "Stop the purge, Garrett," Vivian said, her voice dropping its usual corporate armor, replaced by an urgent, raw plea. "You built the foundation. You have the master override. Command the system to shut down." "I built the foundation, Miss Sterling," Garrett replied, his eyes tracking the frantic lines of crimson code flashing on his rugged digital slate. "But Thorne and his team spent the last 8 years layering thousands of lines of proprietary digital bloat over my architecture. My legacy overrides can freeze the mechanical hardware like the ignition grids, but they cannot stop a system-wide database purge initiated by an authenticated internal terminal." Thorne scrambled forward, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the shattered glass of his tablet. We have to sever the primary fiber optic trunks in the server basement. If we cut the physical lines, the data transfer stops." "If you cut those lines," Garrett said, his voice dropping into a chillingly cold register that made Thorne freeze mid-step, "the system will detect a catastrophic hardware fault. It will immediately trigger an automatic off-site cloud wipe as a fail-safe security measure. You would be executing the attacker's final phase for them. Thorne looked completely paralyzed, his elite engineering degrees entirely useless against a real-world tactical crisis. Garrett didn't wait for the avionics chief to recover. He stepped directly to the main terminal casing on the wall, his large hands gripping the reinforced aluminum frame. With a single heavy surge of physical strength, he tore the diagnostic panel completely free from its mounts, exposing the raw fiber threads beneath. He connected his battered digital slate directly into the primary communication bus, using a worn, oil-stained serial cable. "I cannot stop the deletion," Garrett muttered, his fingers typing localized commands into his slate with impossible speed. "But I can redirect the destination pathways. I am forcing the system to mirror the encrypted log packets onto this slate before the main server corrupts them." Vivian watched his massive hands move with a fluid, terrifying dexterity. "How much time do we have left?" 90 seconds before the Terminal 4 node completes the deletion loop, Garrett answered without looking up. But the person executing this command isn't sitting at Terminal 4 anymore. They initiated the sequence from the automated fueling station and immediately moved to a secondary location. Vivian's eyes narrowed into razor-sharp points. Where are they going? Garrett's slate let out a sharp, low-frequency digital ping. They are heading for the secondary runway maintenance hangar, the fuel truck staging area. There is a high-frequency transmitter tower out there that connects directly to our regional satellite uplink. Vivian's breath hitched. "They aren't just trying to hide their tracks," she whispered, the horrifying realization clicking into place. "They are trying to broadcast the prototype jet's structural flight blueprints to an external server before the internal logs vanish. If those weaponized aerodynamic schematics hit the foreign markets, Aero Vanguard is destroyed by morning." She reached for her executive security radio, but the speaker only spat back a deafening wave of white noise. The internal communication lines were completely dead. Garrett disconnected his slate with a sharp jerk. The massive wall monitors flickered twice and went completely black. The first phase of the system wipe was complete. Throughout the vast facility, the automated emergency red lights died, plunging the executive lounge into absolute darkness, illuminated only by the pale silver moonlight streaming through the floor-to-soiling windows and the faint amber glow of Garrett's handheld device. Garrett turned toward the exit door, his towering frame cutting a dark shadow against the glass. "Take Julian and stay inside this room," he commanded Vivian, his voice an unshakable anchor in the dark. "The structural blast doors are unlocked from the inside now because of the analog short I pulled. Lock them the second I step through." Vivian looked at him, her hands trembling as she stepped closer. This man, whom she had dismissed as a low-level worker, was the only shield standing between her family and absolute ruin. "Garrett, wait," she whispered, her voice laced with rare vulnerability. "You are going out into a darkened hangar alone. Whoever is doing this just tried to incinerate us. They could be armed." Garrett paused at the threshold of the heavy glass door. He didn't turn back to look at her, but his broad shoulders tightened beneath his faded uniform. "They tried to take away my quiet life, Miss Sterling," he said quietly. "That was their first mistake." Julian stepped forward, his small voice echoing softly in the silent room. "Mr. Garrett?" Garrett stopped. He turned his head slightly in the gloom. "Don't let them hurt the plane," Julian whispered, clutching the silver bolt tight inside his fist. Garrett's expression softened just enough for the little boy to see. "Nobody touches the plane on my watch, Inspector. Keep holding onto that bolt." With a definitive movement, Garrett pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped out into the freezing massive cavern of the main hangar bay. The suffocating scent of raw aviation fuel hung heavy in the air, swirling around the dark silhouette of the experimental luxury jet. The silence inside the massive structure was deafening, broken only by the distant rhythmic clicking of cooling metal from the aircraft's disabled turbines. Garrett moved like a phantom through the shadows. His quiet masculinity carried a heavy, calculated presence. He didn't look like a mechanic anymore. The way he cut through the open spaces, keeping his center of gravity low, utilizing the massive landing gears of the private jets as tactical cover, revealed a man who had hunted in dark corridors, long before he ever picked up a tool cart. His digital slate pulsed a soft amber light in his palm, tracking the satellite transmitter data. The distance countdown was dropping fast. 300 yards, 200 yards. Suddenly, a sharp metallic click echoed from the far western edge of the maintenance bay, right near fuel truck number 7. Garrett froze instantly, pressing his back against the thick rubber tire of a nearby transport van. He slowly slipped a heavy, solid steel torque bar from his utility belt, his fingers wrapping around the cold iron with an absolute lethal familiarity. Through the darkness, the faint glow of a high-end, military-grade laptop illuminated a figure standing at the fuel truck's terminal console. Garrett's eyes narrowed to razor-sharp points as the screen's light reflected off the face of the saboteur. It wasn't an outside operative. It wasn't a corporate spy from a rival firm. It was someone who held a master key to the entire airfield, a person who had been standing right beside them from the very beginning. The pale blue light of the encrypted laptop cast a ghostly glow over the face of Preston Caldwell, the director of airfield operations. He was typing frantically, his fingers flying across a customized military-grade keyboard, resting on the utility bumper of fuel truck number 7. Sweat beaded along his hairline, his expensive silk tie loosened at the collar. He was so consumed by the scrolling progress bar of the satellite transmission that he didn't hear the steady measured footsteps approaching from the shadows. "The satellite uplink is dead, Preston," Garrett said. His voice didn't carry anger. It carried the cold, absolute weight of an unshakable truth. Caldwell spun around, his heel slipping slightly in the thin sheen of aviation fuel on the concrete. When his eyes locked onto Garrett's grease-stained uniform, his panicked expression instantly shifted into a mask of elite, condescending arrogance. He slammed the laptop screen halfway shut, attempting to obscure the data. "Vance?" Caldwell scoffed, his chest heaving as he tried to claw back his composure. "What the hell are you doing out of your sector? The entire facility is experiencing a catastrophic systems automation failure. Get your ass back to the maintenance bays before I have you permanently terminated and stripped of your pension." Garrett didn't stop walking. He kept moving forward, his massive frame eating up the distance until he stood just 5 feet away from the director. The heavy steel torque bar in his right hand caught the faint moonlight, its dark, solid weight a silent testament to the physical reality Garrett commanded. "I didn't just redirect the database logs from the executive lounge, Preston," Garrett said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate directly through the floorboards. "The moment you initiated the database purge from Terminal 4, my legacy protocols recognized the digital footprint. I locked the secondary high-frequency satellite array into a closed diagnostic loop 40 seconds ago. Your broadcast isn't hitting a foreign server. It's bouncing off a dead relay 2 miles out in the desert." Caldwell's eyes widened in sudden frantic disbelief. He snapped the laptop open completely. The progress bar had frozen at 99%, replaced by a flashing amber system text. "Communication vector isolated. Legacy protocol Vance active. This is a proprietary Aero Vanguard network." Caldwell hissed, his voice cracking as the elite control he had maintained for years began to unravel. "You're a line item mechanic, an hourly grease monkey who scrubs grease off landing struts. You don't have the clearance to view this data, let alone alter a satellite uplink pathway. One phone call from me to federal security and you'll spend the rest of your life in a maximum security cell for corporate espionage." Garrett reached down to his utility belt. He didn't look at Caldwell's face. He pulled the worn serial cable from his rugged digital slate and snapped it directly into the master diagnostic port built into the side of the fuel truck's digital pump. "I didn't just lock the satellite array, Preston," Garrett murmured, his fingers tapping 3 definitive keys on his slate. "I initiated a Project Vanguard master architecture recall." Suddenly, a massive mechanical groan echoed through the structural steel pillars of the entire airfield complex. The main circuit breakers in the high-voltage room slammed shut with a deafening, thunderous boom that sounded like a localized explosion. Instantly, the pitch-black cavern of the massive hangar bay was violently flooded with hundreds of thousands of lumens of brilliant, blinding, white halogen light. Caldwell shielded his eyes, stumbling backward against the massive rubber tire of the fuel truck as the sheer brightness stripped away his shadows. At the far end of the facility, the multi-ton iron blast doors began to grind upward, lifting toward the reinforced ceiling. Outside on the pristine tarmac, the early morning sun was just breaking over the misty horizon, illuminating 3 arriving luxury transport vans emblazoned with the platinum crest of the Apex Global Syndicate. The primary international investors Vivian Sterling had been preparing to meet. Vivian stepped out of the shattered executive lounge doors, her boots snapping against the polished concrete with a terrifying rhythmic intensity. Her silver hair caught the harsh halogen glare, her face set into a mask of pure absolute corporate retribution. Right beside her walked Julian, his small shoulders squared, his hand tucked safely inside his pocket, clutching the silver bolt Garrett had given him. Behind them, Marcus Thorne followed like a ghost, his hands shaking, completely broken by the realization of how utterly outmatched his engineering department had been. High above the hangar floor, the massive multi-million-dollar digital presentation arrays, the giant screens designed to show the promotional marketing videos for the prototype aircraft, flickered to life, but they weren't displaying luxury interiors or aerodynamic flight statistics. Garrett's master recall had forced the entire facility's display network to mirror Caldwell's active laptop screen in real time. Towering 50 feet in the air for every arriving investor, security guard, and corporate executive to see was the exact blueprint of the weaponized flight controls, the offshore bank routing numbers, and Preston Caldwell's personal, biometric digital encryption signature stamped directly across the theft logs. The international investors stopped dead in their tracks at the edge of the tarmac, their jaws dropping as they stared up at the massive, incriminating display. The airfield's elite security force, finally freed from the digital lockdown, flooded across the concrete floor with their sidearms drawn. They completely bypassed Garrett, their boots forming a tight, tactical perimeter around Fuel Truck 7, their weapons locking directly onto the trembling director of operations. Caldwell looked up at the towering screens, the absolute reality of his complete public ruin hitting him like a physical blow. The color drained from his face until he looked like a corpse. He turned his frantic, sweating gaze to Vivian, then slowly looked back at the quiet mechanic standing beside the pump terminal. "How?" Caldwell whispered, his voice completely stripped of its elite arrogance, reduced to a pathetic, broken whimper. "How does an ordinary mechanic override an executive security signature?" Vivian Sterling stepped into the center of the security perimeter, her sharp gaze cutting through Caldwell like a blade. "He didn't override it as a mechanic, Preston," Vivian said, her voice echoing through the vast, silent hangar with an absolute authority that made every investor outside lean in to listen. "He built the very foundation of the company you just tried to destroy." She turned her eyes to Garrett, a profound, humbling respect softening the hard edges of her face. Caldwell collapsed against the side of the truck as the security officers grabbed his arms, dragging him away from the terminal. But as the crowd of executives and investors began to murmur in stunned realization, staring at the humble man in the grease-stained uniform, Garrett simply disconnected his slate, completely, unbothered by the sudden worship of the elite crowd around him. But as the main display began to settle, a tiny, localized warning tone chirped from the bottom of Garrett's handheld device, a single unread system alert that froze his fingers mid-movement. The tiny, rhythmic chirp from Garrett's digital slate cut through the ambient murmur of the gathering crowd. He looked down at the scratched display, bypassing the corporate security alerts. The airfield's main power restoration had re-established the remote network link to his small, modest cabin tucked away in the pine hills of Blackwood Ridge. The screen displayed a live, low-light security feed of a quiet bedroom. There was Chloe, curled up beneath her patched quilt, snoring softly with her favorite balsa wood glider resting on the nightstand beside her. Garrett exhaled a long, silent breath. The tension in his shoulders, the cold, calculated alertness that had governed his body for the last hour, evaporated instantly. The terrifying tactical architect vanished, leaving behind only a tired father who wanted nothing more than to go home and make breakfast for his daughter. He slipped the rugged device back into his deep uniform pocket, completely ignoring the massive 50-foot display behind him that still flashed the evidence of Preston Caldwell's corporate treason. The international investors from the Apex Global Syndicate began moving across the concrete floor, their tailored wool coats snapping around their ankles as they converged on the maintenance bay. Their lead representative, a sharp-featured man who recognized the historical value of Project Vanguard, stepped forward with an extended hand, his eyes locked onto Garrett's grease-stained uniform, with absolute fascination. "Chief Engineer Vance," the investor said, his voice dripping with sudden sycophantic reverence. "We had no idea you were alive, let alone working within the local logistics sector. The architecture you displayed tonight is worth more than the entire Aero Vanguard fleet combined. Our syndicate would be deeply honored to discuss a private consultation contract. Name your price." Garrett didn't reach out to shake the man's hand. He simply kept his arms relaxed at his sides, his quiet masculinity an unmovable wall against the glittering promises of corporate wealth. "I'm off the clock, sir," Garrett said softly. "And my name is just Garrett." Before the investors could swarm him further, Vivian Sterling stepped into the space between them. Her presence was commanding, her posture flawless, but as she stood close to Garrett, the sharp defensive armor she usually wore around her employees seemed to melt away. She looked at the international executives with a cold, protective glare that left no room for negotiation. "The chief engineer's contract is proprietary to this facility," Vivian announced, her voice steady and absolute, cutting off the investors instantly. "Aero Vanguard is concluding its internal security review tonight. The presentation is deferred until noon. My staff will escort you to the primary briefing room." The investors hesitated, but the sheer executive weight Vivian wielded was impossible to challenge. They bowed their heads slightly and began to retreat toward the luxury transport vans, whispering frantically among themselves about the legendary ghost who had just saved the corporation from total ruin. When the crowd finally dispersed, leaving the massive hangar bay empty save for the quiet security guards patrolling the perimeter, the silence returned. Vivian turned slowly to face Garrett. The brilliant morning light was pouring through the massive open blast doors now, casting long golden illumination across the polished floorboards. For the first time since Garrett had known her, the cold, ruthless billionaire looked completely human. Her hands, usually locked in tight, controlled gestures, were trembling slightly against her sides. The residual adrenaline of nearly losing her son, her company and her life was finally catching up to her. She looked at Garrett's faded blue uniform, then up to his calm, dark eyes. "You could have let the system burn, Garrett," she whispered, her voice cracking with a rare, genuine vulnerability that she had never shown to a single soul in her corporate empire. "After how Marcus Thorne treated you, after how I dismissed you, you had every reason to pick up your tools and walk out those gates." Garrett looked down at her, his expression warm and entirely grounded. He didn't offer a lecture, and he didn't use her vulnerability to elevate his own status. He simply took a single step closer, his broad frame providing a natural shield against the harsh halogen glare of the facility. "The machines don't care about corporate titles, Ms. Sterling," Garrett said gently, his low rumble carrying a profound sense of comfort. "But people do. I didn't stay to save the prototype. I stayed because there was a little boy in that room who needed to know the walls would hold." At the mention of his name, Julian stepped out from behind his mother. The little boy's face was pale, but the frantic, terrifying panic that had consumed him during the lockdown was completely gone. He walked right up to Garrett's work boots, looking up at the massive mechanic with an expression of pure, unshakable trust. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the tiny silver bolt, holding it up like a badge of honor. "I kept the walls steady, Mr. Garrett," Julian whispered softly, his small chest swelling with pride, "just like you said." Garrett slowly knelt down on the hard concrete, dropping to the boy's exact level once again. A genuine, incredibly warm smile broke through the hardened lines of his face. He reached out, his large, grease-stained thumb gently tapping the silver bolt in Julian's palm. "You did an exceptional job, Chief Inspector," Garrett murmured, his voice thick with a father's innate pride. "The whole airfield is secure because you held the line. You keep that bolt safe. It means you're part of the crew now." Julian beamed, turning to show his mother the bolt, as if it were worth more than all the luxury toys in their penthouse suite. Vivian watched the interaction, her chest heaving as a profound realization washed over her. She had spent her entire life accumulating billions of dollars, building glass fortresses and commanding armies of developers, believing that absolute power was the only way to protect her family. Yet, in the span of a single night, this humble, quiet single father had given her son a sense of absolute emotional security that all her wealth could never buy. She had everything the world could offer, except the internal peace this man carried in his very soul. She looked at Garrett as he stood back up, her eyes lingering on his rugged profile with an intensity that made the air between them feel thick and charged with an unspoken emotional chemistry. It wasn't the forced romance of a corporate gala. It was the deep, undeniable attraction of a guarded woman, realizing she had finally found a man who could give her safety without even trying. "Garrett," Vivian said softly, her voice dropping to a private whisper as she took a tentative step toward him. "The board, the entire industry is going to want you back in the main chair. I can rewrite the corporate bylaws. I can give you the entire engineering division." Garrett looked out through the open blast doors toward the distant mountain horizon, where the fog was slowly clearing. "My daughter wakes up in exactly 1 hour, Miss Sterling," he said quietly, his voice carrying the finality of a choice made long ago. "And we have a cardboard wind tunnel to build on the kitchen table." Before Vivian could reply, Marcus Thorne stumbled toward them from the ruined terminal console, his face completely pale as he clutched a secondary printout of the recovered log files. "Vance, Chief Engineer," Thorne stammered, his voice shaking with a terrifying new panic. "You need to look at this." Preston Caldwell was the one who initiated the physical fuel dump, but the encrypted access token he used to bypass the primary server, it didn't belong to his office. Garrett's eyes narrowed, the gentle fatherly warmth vanishing instantly as his jaw locked back into a dangerous military grid line. "Whose token was it, Thorne?" Thorne swallowed hard, pointing a trembling finger at the bottom of the data sheet. The authorization didn't come from inside this airfield at all. The master encryption key was broadcasted from a private digital vault owned by the primary offshore banking trustees of the Apex Global Syndicate. The investors outside, they didn't come here to buy the plane, Garrett. They already bought the man who was supposed to destroy it. Garrett took the datasheet from Marcus Thorne's trembling hand. His eyes scanned the encrypted strings of the master token. matching the digital fingerprint against the decrypted records on his rugged slate. The signature belonged to a terminal registered in Zurich, directly tied to the primary funding vault of the Apex Global Syndicate. "They didn't come to invest in Aero Vanguard," Garrett said, his voice entirely steady as he looked up at Vivian. "They came to bankrupt it from the inside, trigger a safety liquidation clause, and buy the proprietary defense architecture for pennies on the dollar. Caldwell was just their cleanup man." Vivian's eyes flared with a lethal, icy resolve. The maternal panic that had gripped her just minutes ago hardened into the fierce, unyielding fury of a woman who had almost lost her child to corporate greed. She looked out toward the tarmac, where the 3 luxury transport vans were idling, their doors open, as the investors prepared to escape before the local authorities could sort through the facilities. Blackout. "They aren't leaving this airfield," Vivian said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, chilling whisper. She didn't call her corporate security team this time. Instead, she looked at Garrett. For the first time in her life, the billionaire executive wasn't looking at a subordinate for a status report. She was looking at a man who commanded absolute reality, placing her entire empire into his calloused hands. Garrett didn't say a word. He walked out of the maintenance bay and stepped onto the sunlit asphalt of the main runway. The crisp morning air swept across his faded uniform, but the hundreds of engineers, ground crew workers, and security staff who had gathered outside didn't see a mechanic anymore. They saw the giant 50-foot display screens behind him, still glowing with the undeniable proof of the conspiracy. They saw a living legend walking with a quiet, powerful masculinity that demanded absolute silence. Harrison Drake, the senior managing partner of the Apex Global Syndicate, was stepping into the lead transport van when Garrett's shadow fell across the vehicle's polished door. "Is there a problem, mechanic?" Drake asked, his voice dripping with smooth, aristocratic arrogance as he adjusted his sunglasses. "Your CEO has deferred our meeting. We have a private flight to catch." "Your flight is canceled, Mr. Drake," Garrett said, his low rumble carrying across the open tarmac, causing every security guard and ground crewman to freeze. Drake scoffed, a patronizing smile crossing his face as he looked around at the gathering crowd of workers. "Are you out of your mind? You are a low-level service employee. You don't dictate schedules to the people who hold the financial lifeblood of this entire corporation. Step aside before I have you thrown off this property." Vivian Sterling stepped up right beside Garrett, her posture commanding, her sharp eyes locked onto the investor. "He doesn't work for you, Harrison, and as of 30 seconds ago, neither do I." Garrett raised his rugged digital slate, pressing a single definitive key. The primary security gates at the far end of the Crestview Ridge Executive Airfield slammed shut with a thunderous hydraulic crash. Simultaneously, the state police cruisers and federal transport vans that had been quietly summoned by Garrett's legacy recall protocol roared through the auxiliary entrance, their sirens wailing as they formed a tight, flashing perimeter around the investors' vehicles. Garrett pointed to the massive presentation array towering over the hangar. The screen shifted, displaying a real-time tracking map of the offshore accounts. Accompanied by the specific biometric clearance token Harrison Drake had used to authorize the system's sabotage from his private suite. "The federal authorities already have the decryption keys, Drake," Garrett said calmly, his voice slicing through the investor's fading confidence. "I mirrored your entire transfer log to the Regional Defense Database 5 minutes ago. You didn't just commit corporate theft. You targeted a classified military infrastructure contract. That's a federal treason charge." Harrison Drake's aristocratic smile completely vanished. The color drained from his face until he looked identical to the ruined Preston Caldwell. He looked at the federal agents, stepping out of their vehicles with federal warrants, then back at the quiet man in the grease-stained uniform, who had systematically dismantled a multi-billion-dollar international conspiracy with a battered digital slate and a legacy cable. Without a single word left to speak, Drake lowered his head as the agent stepped forward, clicking handcuffs around his wrists in front of the entire cheering airfield staff. Marcus Thorne stood near the hangar doors, watching his elite tech department openly applaud the humble night shift mechanic they had spent months mocking. Thorne slowly lowered his head, utterly humbled, realizing that all his prestigious engineering degrees and corporate titles meant absolutely nothing compared to the raw, unyielding genius of the man, pushing the tool cart. As the authorities cleared the tarmac, Vivian turned back to Garrett. The golden morning light illuminated the thin lines of exhaustion on her face, but her gaze was soft, filled with a profound emotional reverence. Julian stood beside her, his small hand still tucked inside his pocket, holding the silver bolt. "The board is going to reinstate the original Project Vanguard charter today, Garrett," Vivian said softly, her voice carrying a rare personal warmth that didn't belong in an executive boardroom. We need a chief engineer who can rebuild this company from the ground up. I want you to take the center chair. Name your salary. Name your terms. You can have anything you want." Garrett looked down at his calloused hands, then down at Julian, who was looking up at him with unshakable trust. Garrett smiled faintly, a gentle, protective warmth returning to his eyes. "I already have everything I want, Miss Sterling," Garrett said quietly. "I have a 7-year-old girl waiting for me at home, and she doesn't care about corporate charters or defense contracts. She just wants her dad." Vivian's breath hitched in her throat. She looked at this incredible man, realizing that his quiet strength didn't come from his technical genius or his military past. It came from his complete devotion to the only thing that truly mattered. She felt a deep, powerful ache in her chest, a realization that she didn't want to lose the absolute safety this man brought into her world. "Then let us drive you home," Vivian whispered, her voice laced with a genuine, hopeful emotion. "Julian and I have never seen a cardboard wind tunnel. We'd love to help build it." Garrett looked at her, studying the sincerity in her eyes, before nodding once with a gentle warmth. "The tools are on the kitchen table, Miss Sterling. Let's go home." 20 minutes later, Garrett's old, dented pickup truck rattled up the winding gravel driveway of the small cabin in Blackwood Ridge, followed closely by Vivian's sleek executive. Transport. The mountain fog had completely cleared, leaving the pine trees glistening under a beautiful, brilliant blue sky. The moment the truck came to a halt, the front door of the cabin burst open. Chloe came running across the green grass, her bright hair matching the morning sun, her laughter echoing through the quiet valley. "Daddy," she cried, throwing her small arms around Garrett's neck the moment he stepped out of the cab. Garrett lifted her effortlessly against his chest, burying his face in her shoulder as he held her tight, his entire universe perfectly balanced in his arms. The high-stakes tech wars, the corporate sabotage, and the multi-billion-dollar empires faded into absolute insignificance against the sound of his daughter's voice. Vivian stepped out of her car, holding Julian's hand as they walked up the gravel path. Chloe blinked, looking at the elegant woman, and the little boy with a curious, bright smile. "Chloe," Garrett said gently, setting her down but keeping his hand securely on her shoulder. "This is Miss Sterling and her son Julian. They're part of the inspection crew today. They came to help us finish the wind tunnel." Julian stepped forward, proudly, pulling the silver bolt from his pocket and showing it to Chloe. "Your dad said I'm part of the crew now," the boy whispered happily. Chloe's face lit up with absolute joy. "Come on inside. The glue is already dry on the balsa wood." She grabbed Julian's hand, leading him toward the front porch while the two children laughed, completely enveloped in the pure, unbothered safety of the mountain cabin. Vivian stood at the bottom of the porch steps watching them. She looked at the modest wooden home, then turned her eyes back to Garrett, who was standing beside her with his hands tucked into his utility belt, a picture of quiet, masculine contentment. The immense pressure of her corporate life, the endless negotiations, and the cold loneliness of her glass tower felt a million miles away. Looking at Garrett, she realized she had finally found the one thing her money could never buy, a place where she could simply breathe.
"Thank you, Chief Engineer Vance,"
Vivian murmured, stepping closer until her shoulder brushed against his, her voice filled with a beautiful, lingering promise. "Just Garrett, Vivian," he replied softly, his steady eyes locking onto hers with an unshakable warmth, as they walked up the steps together into the bright, hopeful future they were about to build.